Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. It's been a couple of weeks since I've been doing the show. I had a doctor's appointment week before last and eye surgery on my right eye again last week, which was unfortunately not so successful. Trying to get my right eye to 20/20. They got it down to maybe 40/20, but didn't work out as planned. Couldn't do last week's show. Doing a bit of a change up tonight. We have a great guest lined up. Dr. David Seaman is with us tonight, and it's going to be some pretty great material tonight. Dr. Seaman is really the pioneer behind de-inflammation research and publications on diet and nutrition. And he published one of the first, if not the very first, paper on this topic. And of course, you're probably very little recognized for that at this point. Just like this article you sent me earlier today, the doctor who started the whole paleo thing isn't even known for doing the paleo thing today. But Dr. David Seaman, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm going to start off. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you got into this area of research?
Well, I was always interested in nutrition. And after you go through any educational program where you basically just memorize words, so you're basically just living in the land of no rhetoric, just grammar and hopefully a little bit of logic, but you're really doing a paper chase. So after I graduated from actually chiropractic college, I was taking a post-grad class and it was being taught by a British neuroscientist. And the topic was pain and well, really it was pain mostly. But when he described the pain pathways for the first time where I didn't have to worry about an exam, I saw all these various biochemicals that were up on the screen, and I recognized most of them, and at least half of them I recognized were related to what we eat. And so that was 1987. And so I basically went to the library, painstakingly year after year after year, and I collected about probably 10,000 in the old days. You actually had to have photocopies. So I've got 10 metal filing cabinets, 4 drawers high in my garage, packed with papers A to Z. And so after I got into that, I finally started writing some articles because you have to go through the grammar and then the logic before you can actually lay something down on paper or talk about it. So before I wrote that paper, I wrote this book, which was the first book that I'm aware of that was ever written on, you see the title, Clinical Nutrition for Pain, Inflammation, and Tissue Healing. And on the cover, you can see all those, well, you can't really see the details, but there are 6 biochemical pathways. So those are the pathways that I relearned. And so then I started to write more scientific articles. And in 2002, I wrote a paper called The Diet-Induced Pro-Inflammatory State. And within a couple of years, that was being cited. Basically, the way you can tell if anything that someone does in science is really valuable or others see value is that they reference you. So it turns out that article that I wrote in 2002 was then very quickly referenced by researchers at Harvard on 2 occasions. And then my other pain paper was referenced by the director of pain management for Harvard. So that was kind of my orientation. So I've been writing papers and books basically ever since that point in time. That kind of captured my mind more than anything else. And so my orientation to nutrition and diet is really more based upon the inflammatory potential rather than calling it a term like, vegan diet or vegetarian diet or plant-based diet, which of course is just code for radical veganism, or paleo. And I like Dr. Lauren Cordain. I've known the guy for years. But to me, paleo describes an era and then an eating pattern based upon geographic location rather than looking at diet from the perspective of outcome, which takes you away from the emotions of nutrition. And eating is a primordial drive, and food tastes good or not so good. And we tend to like food that tastes kind of sugary, salty, fatty, and that could be some really bad food, like down the south, like hush puppies are just lethal in terms of pro-inflammatory calories. So I look at those types of foods for their inflammatory potential rather than never or it's okay or not okay. So I based upon the inflammatory potential, and then as time went on, I realized that obesity, it was probably 10 years ago when the literature started coming out first, that that the obesity state, which is created by overconsuming calories, usually sugar, flour, and refined oils, the fat cells, they actually swell in size. And as the fat cells swell in size, they invite in through chemotactic agents, which is how cells kind of communicate, a whole bunch of pro-inflammatory immune cells. And so the obesity state's actually a low-grade infection-like state from the perspective of immunity, no fever, but the immune profile is identical to a viral infection and cancer when one crosses into the obesity threshold. So that's basically the kind of the orientation.
How did you manage to come across my research and show?
Well, that's a good question because when I realized that uh, television was a complete waste of time, which I've known for a long time, but then when YouTube started to kind of kick in and you start looking around for information that would be educational to me from the perspective of whether it be science or, and for me, science is not so much the science that people talk about, like, creationism versus the Big Bang. People in their brains, they think that's science, and really both are theories when you get right down to it, since we really don't know. So that's not what I look for. But then I look at history, and then I forget what it was that came up. I forget how the trivium came up, but that's when I came across you. And I think also I came across your interview with Joe Rogan, that one several years ago, and then you were never on again. Yeah,
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 2011. Yeah, one of the
yeah.
top 3 worst interviews I've ever had. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was that, and I started looking at, how logical you were with stuff, and also how like painstakingly detailed you were, and that was what kind of attracted me to what you were doing.
Interesting. Well, so and then so it was probably what 3-4 months ago. You had sent me an envelope with the book, and I thought it was somebody else. I thought it was a show host whose name is David Seaman, and I was like, wonder what he's writing. And then I opened it up, and inside was this and a donation. So thank you for that, and for the book and all. And you also included a couple of papers in there, which are in the other room, but. So, you wanted to go into more depth, and you had told me that I had a lot correct and some things wrong regarding diet, nutrition, inflammation, keto diet, etc. And over the years, well, let's see, it probably started out with Dr. William Davis, author of Wheat Belly, back in like 2010 or 2011. I had him on. And that was explosive for a lot of people in the audience. This was before he was on Oprah and, just completely blew up in the no grain world. And, so he's really who helped me turn my health around. And I had been in and out of the hospital for 15 years, over 41 trips to the emergency room and this kind of stuff. Now I haven't been back to the hospital for chronic inflammation and IBS type of stuff for almost 10 years now, maybe 9.5 years. And so Davis helped me, and then I came across, as you know, Dave Asprey's work, and it was really when I started going high fat and getting over my fears of what fat is and drinking butter and coffee and tea and this kind of stuff that was what really got my health finally turned around. I got rid of the inflammation, but it took me years to like really feel like I was 100% again after 41 trips to the emergency room. I spent 5.5 days in the ICU in Peru. And
Jeez.
for 15 years, I pretty much just puked my guts out, and that was actually when I started the show. I couldn't hold down a job. I got into doing research, and I started the show initially very leftist and doing research on psychedelics, and then realizing through the trivium that that was all a bunch of baloney, and I exposed that and a lot of other things on the way. But it was from being sick all the time back in 2008 when I started the show. So that was kind of how I got onto this path, and then I got many hundreds, if not thousands, of emails over the years from people thanking me for helping them with their diet and nutrition issues, getting them off of wheat, getting them on a high-fat diet. And I'd never heard from one person in the audience who didn't have a dramatic turnaround. And so then you contact me and you're like, well, you got it mostly right, but there's a few things wrong. So I'd like to come on and correct it. I'm like, yeah, sure, let's do this. So
Well, I figure since you're a logos trivium guy, you wouldn't take it personally.
not at all. I appreciate,
Yeah.
you know, here's the thing is most people, they just tell you you're wrong and then they name call at you and they can't support your arguments, or they'll cite second, third, fourth, fifth hand citations. And they don't provide any citations. And then they criticize you for not taking their feedback. And it's like, well, you know, what's your background? What's the research? What information do you have? So you actually have some. So, you know, I appreciate real research, and you've published actual papers that people can fact check and look at your data. So, you know, why not? It makes sense, right?
So when you went to the hospital all those times, did they actually give you a definitive diagnosis? Was it a gluten sensitivity, a celiac disease, or was it
No,
IBS?
it was I'm bullshitting, or what I call IBS, and I went to 12 doctors in the U.S. and all of them are what I would call incompetent, you know. And I finally I was living out in L.A. at the time, and I went to this doctor who somebody just posted a super chat, and but I went. He said, "Hey, boss, you're conquering this. I've been low carb for 2 years now, lost 60 pounds. By the way, have you heard the new Teddy Spaghetti cookbook?" And I haven't heard of all of that, but anyway, thank you for the super chat. By the way, thanks for supporting the show, folks. Really need your help and donations and support. But and now I just lost my train of thought. Where was I?
You were doing the spaghetti thing, the Teddy spaghetti deal.
Well, no, before that, what was I on?
The misdiagnosis.
So yeah, 12 doctors, and then went to this doctor out in L.A. And I'll never forget this. And I really pissed this doctor off to the point he almost threw me out of the office. And, you know, so I'm like, look, I need to get to the root of this. I want to find out what's causing it. And he says, well, you know, you've been to 11 doctors before me. You know, what makes you think I'm going to figure anything out? You know, basically saying I'm incompetent. And then, you know, himself admitting he's incompetent. And then he says, so you're going to have to take this pill. You're probably not going to live past the age of 45, which I've superseded at this point. And you're going to need to take these pills for the rest of your life. And I said, so your diagnosis is that I'm deficient in your pills. And he just went through the roof at that point. It was like I just called his bluff on his whole life's fraud, you know, as far as dispensing pills for, you know, curing everything. And so, you know, he basically just wrote the prescription, told me to get out of his office. And so he did not like that one bit. I was rather humored by the whole event. And so in 2009, which was, probably 2 years after this, I went down to Peru. And I had planned to, we had already planned to visit a gastroenterologist in Peru. And so right when we got down there, we got to Arequipa. And then we knew somebody who knew a family member who was studying medicine. He knew the best gastroenterologist in town. So right when we got there, we set up an appointment with this guy. Then the very next day I relapsed, and I'm down at the coast in Mollendo. And we called the doctor, drove all the way back up to Arequipa from Mollendo, and the doctor and 3 or 4 nurses were waiting for me when I was wheeled in, or came in. They brought me in, checked me out for like 5 or 10 minutes, took me straight back to ICU for the next 5.5 days. And so you know, basically what happened is when you're on this grain, wheat, flour, sugar diet, and I was vegetarian at the time, it basically just feeds all kinds of bad bacteria. Things like Helicobacter pylori and whatnot were out of control. So he gets rid of that, and I felt mostly better. But then when I got back, I started relapsing, but without the severe pain. And then like 6 months or a year later was when I met Dr. Davis, and he's like, no, actually wheat disease is way more common. It manifests in like 40 different symptoms, you know, so here, try this. And then that was actually when things started correcting itself.
So you never got an actual diagnosis then?
Never got an actual diagnosis for it,
Yeah.
but it's it's pretty obvious once and I had asked other doctors, what do you think I've heard about wheat intolerance, and they'd just be like, no, that's like 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, it'd be impossible, no way you're allergic to that, and so they just completely avoided the subject.
Well, 1 out of 100 is not that small of a number when you think of the 300 million people in America.
Right.
And so the way it works ultimately, if it's actually a wheat issue, it could be a wheat allergy. So they redefined how people react to wheat in terms of the negative effects. One is called celiac disease, and that is when you get primary gut symptoms, and they're terrible. Um, Diarrhea, you can have fatty stools, aches and pains, and so that's 1 out of 100 people. And then there is something called atypical celiac disease. And I don't know what the number is on that, but I suspect it's the same or a little bit more. And the reason why is because it's so hard to determine, and no one's been tested for all this. But atypical celiac disease is when you actually have it's an autoimmune state. And atypical celiac disease, it can manifest as just chronic headaches. And it typically does so as people age. It can also manifest as numbness and tingling in your extremities, called peripheral neuropathy. You can have cerebellar symptoms, which means all your balance and coordination can be off as well. So that's atypical celiac disease, when the symptoms manifest not from the gut, but from typically the nervous system. And so you have celiac disease, atypical celiac disease, 1 out of 100, maybe a little bit more. And then you have gluten sensitivity, which no one knows the prevalence of that. My guess is it's between 5 and 10% of the population. And then wheat allergy, you really don't know. But here's the thing about whether it be a celiac issue or a gluten issue, because what gluten is, it's kind of funny actually to trash Joe Rogan a little bit, just because why not? He well, the reason why I say that is because he brought on to his show this person who calls herself Babe, and it was a total hit piece on chiropractors. And like any profession, you have some good, some bad, and some confused. And so to just trash an entire profession. But she says she has celiac disease, and she says, well, it's a zonulin thing, and it's not. And Rogan actually said that he thought that basically gluten converts to sugar, and that's the problem. And of course, that never happens as being the problem. So she mentioned this term called zonulin, and zonulin is a protein produced by, if you look at a tube, and imagine that's your gut, you have cells that line the tube, and then below that you have several different layers, and you have immune cells there. Well, the surface cells are called enterocytes, and what they do when they're exposed to gluten fragments, gluten breakdown products, gliadin being the most common, the zonulin can be produced. And what happens then, so if your gut cells, they're supposed to be held together tightly, but when zonulin is produced, it causes the gut cells to separate. And that allows for antigens, food, and bacteria to be absorbed. And then down below, you have a rich immune system there, because that is your first line of defense against foreign invaders. So zonulin separates the gut enterocytes, the gut barrier, and zonulin can be produced by gluten and by the wrong gut bacteria. Those are the two primary causes. So that is why IBS symptoms can literally mimic exactly gluten symptoms for some people. So it sounds like what you had was a zonulin problem caused perhaps by more of the excess carbohydrates. And that's kind of what happens if you eat sugary stuff, flour, and fat with it. Those three together create a problem with your gut flora over time. And then the wrong bacteria can multiply. And when those bacteria, when there are antigens that are absorbed, or stimulate the zonulin system, you get this separation, and you can have a whole host of bizarre symptoms. So here are some examples of what. So the chromosome 16 is where the substance called zonulin localizes, and you have multiple cancers, schizophrenia, autism. What else off the top of my head? That's a lot of them, and then neurodegenerative diseases can all manifest. I mean, think about this: schizophrenia, right? So some people are crazy for their wheat. They are literally crazy for their wheat.
Right. Well, Not only that, and I had sent a study that I had located to Dr. Davis years ago about gluteomorphine and desmethapan, or however you pronounce it. What's the?
Diazepam.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, it's benzodiazepine. Yeah.
yeah, found naturally in wheat. And, so that was interesting too. People are literally going through a withdrawal when they get off of wheat after, it starts hitting about 2 to 3 months, but they start going through a withdrawal symptom. But,
Well, not everybody. Just so some may, but most people don't, and it has to also do with your mindset when you decide to give something up, because our brain is so powerful. Years ago, maybe 10 years ago, and then 3 years ago, the Discovery Channel did two placebo slash nocebo, more placebo, where they faked surgeries. They did these old guys were all kind of crippled and could hardly walk, and you see they're scraggly old Ichabod Crane kind of like gait. And then all they did was they did an incision along the joint line, didn't penetrate in there, cut it up so they didn't touch any joint tissue at all, and they just told the subjects that they had knee surgery, and for many of the participants, they improved substantially, and some people had complete pain relief, and no surgery was done. So, like, it's also like a dentist who remove mercury fillings, which probably isn't a bad idea. Some will say, well, you may have this detox thing, that detox thing. So it gets into the person's head, and then they have the symptoms. So I'm just suggesting because not everybody has this withdrawal experience from wheat. Some may, but most people tend not to. Most people tend not to. So if you did, well, then you had a tough one. But the average person, it's like no big deal. Once you commit your brain to it and you focus on it and you realize why you're doing it, then a whole bunch of good brain chemicals kind of kick in and support you in your efforts.
right. And you kind of get a brain fog that sort of lifts after a couple of months of not eating the stuff as well.
And the reason why that is because the absorbed antigens. So you have these various bacteria. You have gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, and gram-negative bacteria have two layers. So you can my fingers two layers, and sticking out of the outer membrane layer is a substance called endotoxin. It's also called lipopolysaccharide. So endotoxin. When endotoxin or when these gram-negative bacteria are exposed to sugar, flour, and refined oils as the worst one, this is what happens. The endotoxin clips off and you absorb it. So scientists have done meals where they feed them high calories, like 900 calories of basically sugar, flour, refined oils, or just white bread and butter. And then an hour later, 2 hours later, they'll do a blood test and they'll see endotoxin levels spike substantially. And so when endotoxin kicks in, it creates an inflammatory reaction. And if you're susceptible, you can get what they call brain fog. So a lot of people with fibromyalgia, called fibrofog, most fibromyalgia patients, they will have family members with migraine headaches and irritable bowel syndrome, all three of which are pushed into expression via an inflammatory state, and endotoxin seems to be a big one. The best way to find this out is if you have a gut deal, whether it be gluten or whether it be IBS, which is typically caused by an overgrowth of bacteria, is if all you do, like in my book, so in the DeFlame diet, I describe gluten, and then in the other chapter, I describe something called small intestine bacterial overgrowth. So if you wake up in the morning and your gut is flat, you got no gut symptoms, and then you just have a small, medium-sized white potato, just as a test food. If you bloat from that, you likely have overgrowth of bacteria. Now, people say, oh my God, bacteria overgrowth is terrible. Well, first of all, people have to realize that we have more bacteria in our gut than we have cells in our body. So it's not like, oh my God, there's bacteria. There's bacteria everywhere. And so when you eat either white rice, which contains no gluten, or a white potato and you bloat, that suggests that there is a SIBO problem. And there's some drug approaches and natural approaches. The natural approaches typically are just taking a fiber supplement like psyllium and then peppermint oil and or oil of oregano. Really, peppermint oil seems to be the best. And that seems to knock down the SIBO for lots of people. Others need to take a non-absorbed antibiotic. But if one does not bloat from the white potato or the white rice, then you got to eat pure gluten. Now, do you know off the top of your head what pure gluten is called? We may have discussed this, but it's easy to forget, though. Pure gluten If you go to the health food store, the health food store, and you buy pure gluten,
Wheat germ, right?
no, it's actually
No.
called, it's spelled Seitan with a thingy over the A. So they call it Seitan. They should just call it Satan, you know? That's kind of how it really sounds. So you take a slab of Satan first thing in the morning, and if that gives you your symptoms, well, then you know you got a gluten problem. Now, that's kind of like a soft way to determine if you got a gluten problem or a bacteria problem. The reason why you don't want to just go have a piece of pizza is because you got flour and gluten in the dough, and that way you don't know what you have if you react to it. But that is very, very common. So 1 out of 5 adult Americans have small intestine bacterial overgrowth, i.e., irritable bowel syndrome. That's huge. 1 out of 10 people in America have terrible migraines. And so those are more likely than the gluten thing, but there's kind of an overlap between the gluten and the overgrowth problem in the gut because gluten is rarely delivered to the human gut as pure gluten. It's usually gluten flour, so you're always feeding the bacteria. And the symptoms from that can be as terrible as widespread pain, depression, anxiety. I mean, think of all the common symptoms that cause people problems as they age. And this hits particularly young women when they're in college more than young guys because their guts are more sensitive. It initiates that chronic pain and depression that they can live with throughout their entire life, and then end up like you going to Peru. I mean, and you just had to stop eating wheat. You know, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and even bringing that up to the doctors and whatnot, and them saying, "Oh no, that's not it. That's not the problem." You know, and it's like how. They're just, most doctors have about 2 hours or so of nutritional training. They just don't think they think in terms of of dispensing pills, not in terms of solving the problem.
Well, the basic way that no matter what healthcare profession you enter in America, you're taught some basic sciences that are taught in a grammar-like fashion, and you never have any logic imposed or taught, and so therefore the rhetoric part of the trivium is lost. So they're taught to basically identify symptoms and then give drugs for those symptoms. And in the natural world, like the naturopathic world and partly the chiropractic world, and even medical doctors now getting into natural medicine, they typically deliver supplements in the same fashion that they would deliver drugs. So, like, what do you do for depression? Well, you give them St. John's wort. But see, depression though is an inflammatory state. So depression is basically when your body stops producing enough serotonin, and it's kind of interesting actually. And so what they do, they give serotonin reuptake inhibitors to keep more serotonin active in the nervous system. And that is what St. John's wort does. But rarely do you get cures from taking those medications so long as the chronic inflammation is going on. And that is the majority of Americans. If you look at, like, C-reactive protein is a general marker of the inflammatory state in the body. We should have a CRP below 1. It's actually called high sensitivity CRP. It should be below 1. And the average middle-aged American, and that means starting in middle age, which is basically 30, because if you break our lifespan down to thirds, you have 0 to 30, and then 30 to 60. So that's middle age. So you're 12, 13 years away from hitting, like, the senior time. I hit senior like next year, right? So I'm finishing my second third. And so when you think about people living from age 30 and on and living in that depressed state, I mean, it's just it's the most miserable way that the average person can live. So C-reactive protein in middle-aged people, so basically starting from 30 and over, the average American is between 1 and 3, and we should be below 1. 25% of all adult Americans are over 3, which means that the average American is living in a state of chronic inflammation that can give you like 10 different symptoms that look like 10 different organ systems have gone wrong, when the flame, like if my wrist is the flame manifesting all these symptoms, you take away the flame and these symptoms go away. That is not taught in med school. That is not taught in most chiropractic colleges, physical therapy school, massage, nutrition stuff. They just don't learn it like that. So I kind of learned it on my own after I got out of a chiropractic college, because I saw patients who had chronic aches and pains. I changed their diet around without really knowing like the whys and wherefores, just knowing that sugar and flour and those foods are terrible. I saw bizarre aches and pains and other symptoms disappear within a month or not, if not earlier. So that kind of got me thinking more about forgetting the names of diseases and learning their biochemical etiology. And it turns out that basically any chronic disease that you can name, same inflammatory state, be it depression, be it schizophrenia, be it Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, is all the same nasty excess production of pro-inflammatory mediators. The most famous kind of ones now, they're called cytokines. They're pro-inflammatory proteins.
Interesting. All right. So why don't we talk about pigs versus humans for a minute?
Okay. You mean that pig study?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So these paleo research, I mean legitimate. So the legitimate paleo scientists, the person that you want to follow, his name is Loren Cordain. So it's Loren Cordain, Cordain. And so Loren Cordain and his colleagues. And the way you can identify in this world of medicine, nutrition, you would go to a website. It's called PubMed, PubMed.gov. And so if you were to go there and put my name in, you put in Seaman. Now it's kind of funny. Like my last name. I mean, until I was maybe like, I don't know, maybe like 7th or 8th grade, I didn't have a science class that explained reproduction. And it's spelled like a sailor. But when you hear it, you're like, oh my God. So people say, it's awful. So people would say to me, eventually, you got to do your own diet. I'm like, yeah, I can't do the Seaman diet. That would just be so freaking weird, So fortunately, yeah.
At least,
so fortunately,
self-deprecating jokes. That's pretty funny.
Oh, it's awful. I mean, like the worst ever. I was a junior, because basically all my friends in high school I grew up with from like 2nd grade. So Seaman was spelled like sailor, right? No big deal. And so then I became a high jumper. And if anyone who's listening ever ran or participated in field events, they call up 3 of the participants. So it would be Irvin is up, and Rogan is on deck, and Seaman is in the hole. Yeah, so that was just like, needless to say, I didn't clear the bar on that particular jump. So, man, now I forgot where I was going with that. It just seemed like the good time for the old Seaman joke. What were we talking about?
Oh, we were talking about pigs.
The pigs. Yeah, the pigs. So Loren Cordain is the only guy you want to follow, and his research colleagues. And I'm pretty sure that the pig diet was done by Stefan Lindeberg, a Swedish paleo researcher who did a lot of papers with Cordain before he passed away. So what they did is they fed these 2 groups of pigs. It was actually, you will call it a high carbohydrate diet in the scientific sense, not the typical layperson's view of what high carb means, because this high carb diet was basically just vegetables, some of which were potatoes and turnips, and some fish and meat. And so it was a low fat, high vegetation. That technically would be a high carb diet. So that's why I don't like that language a lot of the time. So they fed about, I forget how many calories. They fed basically about 4,500 calories in each group. And the other group, they fed the standard pig grain diet. And the animals that basically ate the same amount of calories, the grain diet animals, their CRP was twice as high or 3 times as high as the vegetation diet. They gained more body fat. Their blood pressure was worse, even though the calories were pretty similar, demonstrating that like living on grains, like to be a breaditarian, is a real problem. And so when people hear that, they think, oh my God, I can never have grains again. And I can tell you that if you don't react, I'm not saying that you should, but if you didn't react to, say, brown rice, it wouldn't kill you to have a small bowl of brown rice every day. That's not going to screw you up unless you're a reactor to that. So when people start thinking about, I got to change my diet around, I can never have dessert again, I can never have grains again, they freak out. Their amygdala, which is like the part of your brain that essentially operates to detect threat and creates fear, and then you get a defensive, aggressive, fleeing, fight or flight reactions. When someone says you can never eat that again, they wig out. And so I would say that for people listening, that diet shows that living on grains is a stupid move. And if you look at all your whole foods, you take, for example, whole grains, legumes, vegetation, all your various potatoes, your sweet potatoes and your yams, and then your meat and cheese and on and on. The least nutritious on a calorie by calorie measurement are whole grains. I mean, they are the least nutritious of all your whole foods. And so the fact that they have been recommended forever by the USDA, since I sent you that image from Simple Suppers Are Best from back in 1919, where the USDA said, simple suppers are best. Feed your children cookies, bread, and milk. 1919, so that's 100 years ago. And so 100 years later, what does the average American eat mostly? Sugar, flour, and milk or dairy in the form of more ice cream and everything else. So we basically complied with our, the oligarch nutrition masters. And the thing about that too is that the stuff tastes good. And so if someone's going to tell you it's good, even though it's terrible, are you pulling that picture up?
I'm looking for it. I'm not finding it here. Sorry.
That's all right. Nope, no problem. But anyway, if people just Google "simple suppers are best" and then hit images, they will see this cute little girl about 6 years of age in the garb of 1919 with milk, cookies, and bread in front of her. Like how could everybody back then knew? Like my great grandfather migrated, fortunately, before World War I from what's now Slovakia, and I mean all they did was grow everything. So they knew vegetables, fish, meat, normal dairy, healthy dairy is all normal, and people lived on it forever and ever. And then the USDA steps in and says, "Now feed your kids cookies and milk." I mean, it's just absolutely unbelievable. So that's kind of a veer off the pig study, but the pig study shows us that vegetation is the way to go, unless, it's really interesting with that Jordan Peterson craze. Because I did a video, it's on my DeFlame nutrition channel that goes over the carnivore diet, and people get it wrong completely. Like people did lots of videos. Jordan Peterson, my hero, is eating only meat, therefore I will. I mean, that's kind of just, it's just not a lot of gray matter, white matter being used to make that move. He and his daughter fell into that disease because of their autoimmune problems. So the only people on Earth who would ever eat only meat for periods of time would be if you're living way up in the Arctic Circle, because that's all you have is fatty meats. And so the carnivore diet is actually a very high fat diet. And there is this anthropologist from Canada. He went up and hung out with the Arctic Circle natives, and it took about 2 weeks to acclimatize to the high fat diet. But this guy lived for 9 years on just meat. This is like 1909. He comes back. He tells the scientists, whatever school he was affiliated with back then, yeah, all we do is eat meat. Everyone feels great. They're like, impossible. We should have heart disease. So this guy checks himself into Bellevue. Now, Bellevue now is crazy, though, right? Like the loony bin hospital in New York. But back then it was a regular hospital. And so every meal he ate for a year was fatty meat. And at the end of that year, no ill health and no unhealthy cardiovascular markers. So it's been known for over 100 years, and there were papers written on it back in the early 1900s that showed, that outlined his approach. So all the people who followed this, all meat diet just because Jordan Peterson was doing it, it demonstrates the lack of logos that you can find basically everywhere. So yeah, I would think that the pig diet really outlines clearly how bad it is to have a grain-based diet.
Well, which is, of course, the foundation of the food pyramid, which is
right.
It's like several years ago, South Park did an episode where they, Cartman is having this dream and turn over the pyramid, and they're and the kids are in South Park going around licking butter pops,
Unbelievable. Yeah. It's really terrible. And the problem when it comes to those foods is that the tasty, sugary, floury, oily, salty combination, it stimulates parts of our brain that other substances like alcohol and cocaine stimulate. And what you get is a pleasure experience. And then what's different for food is that you get the withdrawal effect typically right after you finish your bowl of ice cream. Like as you get to the very end of it, like, and it's gone. And now you have that, it's, and you want more. If you don't worry about it, you wake up the next morning, it's not a big deal. But in that moment, you have a withdrawal effect once you finish eating something tasty, which is why people will say, if I start eating ice cream, I eat the whole damn thing. If I eat some cookies, I just keep eating them. And the reason why is because when you're getting what I call dietary crack, you're getting it the hit moment to moment to moment. And the only time you have the pleasure is when it's on your tongue. Once you swallow it, there are no esophageal receptors that are saying, oh man, this is so good going down. No, it only tastes good in your mouth. And that's why people keep shoving it in there, which is why it's so difficult for people to pull back from those foods.
Interesting. All right. What are the inflammatory foods?
Well, the best way to look at it is this. If you and I could eat enough romaine lettuce to exceed our caloric needs, so let's just say both of us, because we sit a lot, and I'm 10 years older than you, so let's just say my caloric needs in my sedentary writing mode is about 1,800 calories per day, and we'll call you 2,000. So if you and I both eat 3,000 calories per day of broccoli, that will be inflammatory. Anytime you exceed your caloric needs, your body kicks into an inflammatory mode. The issue is that nobody's going to do it with broccoli. So the way we can do it is, let's just say that you're a Green Bay Packers fan and you got your cheese hat on and all you think about is eating cheese. Well, cheese can once you exceed your caloric threshold, will turn the flame on. Subcaloric threshold, typically not a problem. So the most important thing is hypercaloric intake, which is what 70% of the adult Americans currently do. So the first step for hardcore dietary crackheads would be to, if they're really struggling with getting rid of sugary, floury, refined, oily foods, would be to count their calories and get below 2,000, 1,800 calories per day, which is what the average person is, where their caloric balance is. That's the easiest way for the average person to do it. And then if they get rid of more sugar, flour, refined. So basically, I'll show you the cover of my new book. That'll kind of show you. So right here. So this is the DeFlame diet for breast cancer. If you zoom right in there, you can see the healthy breast and then the cancer breast. Now, people who look at this, who are worried about breast cancer, they may go, oh my God, I had bread today. Well, you see, you have to just look at how much bread you really have to pound down for it to be a problem. So if you look at pro-inflammatory calories, that kind of encapsulates it right there. Anything that's deep fried is a problem. So chicken fingers, deep fried, problem.
Let me ask you a question on that. What if it's deep fried in lard or, something like that?
Well, no one really does deep frying, like the deep fryers in lard. But if you just fry in lard, that's not a problem. The reason why it typically is because butter and lard and
so
tallow.
It's just tallow. That's what I want to say also. So it's the oils that are the problem, the vegetable oils.
Yeah, the reason why is because this is where you get into the omega-6 oils and the trans fatty acids. So when you think about like the term free radicals, reactive oxygen species, oxidation, right? So if you take a bite out of an apple, for example, and you let it sit on your counter for a day or so, that bit out part will turn brown. That's oxidation. You can test this at home. You can take a bite of 2 apples and then squeeze lemon juice on the one bite and not the other bite, and you'll see that the lemon juice prevents the oxidation from happening as rapidly. So that is, and if you key a car, it's going to rust. So oxidation kind of means like your body's kind of rusting. So the way these fats work is that the more double bonds they have, and I guess I could probably find a picture of double bond, but anyway, a saturated fat, what that means basically simply is this, is that fats, proteins, and sugars, their primary building blocks are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And usually what you'll have between, if you have a saturated, well, I'll just show you what a picture looks like so you can see. This will actually help your people, right? Exactly what it looks like so they know. So let me find this. Where is it? I got like 50 pages on fats, right? You figure I should just get to it quick. Here we are. We're getting close. Here we go. This is what, can you see that okay?
Yep.
So that is what a saturated fatty acid looks like.
Hold it up a little higher. There you go.
So you can see all those carbons and you can see all the hydrogens. And you can see that there is a single line between all of the carbons. And each of the carbons, except for the ones on the very end, have two hydrogens attached to it. So a saturated fatty acid just means that all the carbons are saturated
Right.
with hydrogen.
And
So let's
polyunsaturated means that there are many that are not saturated, where things can get in there and cause oxidation.
right, exactly. So here
And
is
then they used to tell us that the polyunsaturated were the healthy oils, and
right. So can you see that
we know
okay
it's
there?
yeah. Hold it up a little higher. And now we know that the opposite is true, that the polyunsaturated are the ones that can oxidize and become toxic.
Well, the way this works ultimately is that if you think about, say, fish oil contains EPA and DHA. And if you look at, for example, wild game, they eat a lot of greens. So wild game naturally contains saturated fatty acids, monounsaturated fatty acids, and the polys. And so, but the polys are always in small amounts. Now, one of the interesting things about the polys is that it turns out that iodine is a very, very important mineral that protects your polys from oxidizing. And the average American is really low on the iodine intake scale.
Especially since everybody went to sea salt, so now they're not getting the iodine intake they used to.
Yeah, it's really a problem. Stuff was no, flour used to be iodized as well, and now it's not. So you have the halogen competition. But the saturated fatty acids, where you just see them carbon with all the hydrogens and no double bonds, they don't oxidize because the oxidation occurs where the double bonds are. And that is why deep frying is a real problem. When you deep fry, you have not only the polyunsaturated fatty acids, you have trans fatty acids in there. And the trans fatty acids that are created in the laboratory are very different than the ones that are found in small amounts in animal products. And so you get a double dose of flame when you eat deep fried foods from the restaurants. If you're just frying at home, it's much more intelligent to fry with saturated fatty acids. And I think that tallow and lard are fine to use, and butter as well.
And so somebody just asked in the chat, and throw up your, if you want us to try to get to them more quickly, throw up a super chat. But somebody just asked, what about coconut oil?
Yeah, see, so it's kind of like, what about coconut oil? So here's the way I answer that question, because it's an open-ended, huge possible answer, right? So I actually did a video. It's called Coconut Oil Fake News, because the American Heart Association came out with this thing that scared the crap out of people in the middle of 2018 about how coconut oil is never good for you, it's going to kill you. So I got the paper, read through every single, and the interesting thing about coconut oil, which is what made the news, was that it was a 3-paragraph section that made up half of a column in this article. So I go and I get the 3 references. I go through them very, very carefully. And one of the references that they use supported the claim that the saturated fatty acids in coconut oil are killing anybody. So when you think about coconut oil, so first, if you go to the South Sea Islands, which is where they eat a lot of coconuts. They get most of their fats from coconuts, not too much from fish, because there's not a whole lot of fat in the fish in warm water. And there's no disease at all in relation to coconut oil intake in that context. But let's just say that you and I are doing our best to be, as anti-inflammatory as possible. We're eating lots of vegetables, and we're basically at a 2,000 calorie intake level, which is perfect for us to maintain body weight. There's no surges of excess calories. But then we add 200 or 300 calories per day on top of that of coconut oil. Well, then you'll have a hypercaloric problem created by coconut oil. So you always want to think about your intake of any of these substances in the overall dietary caloric intake view. So just to say, is coconut oil, how is that? If it's consumed at an appropriately caloric level, it will deliver you anti-inflammatory effects. It contains mostly a fatty acid called lauric acid. And when lauric acid gets into the gut microflora converts lauric acid into a substance called monolaurin. And monolaurin is basically a natural antibiotical effect in the gut. So this means that coconut oil consumed in the proper caloric amount in the global view of the diet is fantastic.
Now, somebody just asked if they just wasted their money buying 5 pounds of Himalayan salt. I would just say no to that. Just get some iodine, like sea kelp supplements or something to go with it, so that you're taking that every day and not just, not going without iodine. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, when it comes to iodine, there is the issue of people who have Hashimoto's disease, which is fairly common. And if they take iodine, and they can take some, but if they cross a threshold, then it can make their Hashimoto's worse. But it appears, I mean, in general, taking less than 1,000 micrograms per day seems to be safe for most people, even if they have Hashimoto's. I mean, I can't promise that, obviously.
And what
So,
is Hashimoto's, just for those who don't know?
Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disease of the thyroid gland. And get this, in certain cases of Hashimoto, complete avoidance of gluten completely reverses the thyroid disease.
Okay, so somebody just brought this up, so let's hit this. And you had asked me to bring it up in our email exchange earlier today. So they want to know about cannabis oil. Well, they're probably thinking Rick Simpson, not hemp seed oil. But and I was at Costco the other day with a friend who's actually in the audience right now, and we were walking through Costco. And of course, now there's a big rack of whole hemp seeds on the shelf there, and I said to her, most people wouldn't know that you and I were largely behind getting this stuff on the shelves. It's like we're totally forgotten in our part in getting that stuff out there. But what about hemp? And first, we'll start out with hemp seed and hemp seed oil, and then we can. I don't know if you have anything to say about cannabis oil specifically, but if somebody needs cannabis oil, it's probably because they have an inflammatory response to something that they're eating in their diet. And if they took care of that, they most likely wouldn't need the cannabis oil in most instances.
Probably, it's hard to really say, because if you look at, except for, I don't know about the Eskimos just because they're snowed in so much of the year. But wherever you go on Earth, depending upon your latitude, you have different herbs that are very, very spicy. And these spicy herbs have these fairly potent anti-inflammatory substances. Now, the thing about that is that those. So, if you're in India, for example, turmeric, ginger. If you're in Scandinavia, you don't have any turmeric and ginger there. You're gonna have sage and green spicy vegetation. And so wherever you go, you have these spicy, herby vegetation substances, botanicals. And so if you look across the face of the earth, you'll see that basically nobody historically was obese. So they consumed a normal caloric level for their activity level, and every meal or every day they were likely to take in some of these spicy substances. And so the CBD craze, to me, is just another craze, ultimately. I'm not impressed with CBD oil. And the reason why is because you get the studies have shown that when you just take CBD, people get zero benefit to a lot of benefit. And so all that is basically a botanical having an anti-inflammatory effect. So when it comes to hemp oil itself, hemp oil has a really good profile of omega 6 to omega 3. So it has a nice anti-inflammatory relationship. So I think the best way to get hemp is to do the whole hemp seeds, because then you get all the phytonutrients, the protein. It's fantastic in terms of not creating a blood glucose surge. And by the way, a blood glucose surge after we eat is the biggest stimulator of post-eating inflammation. So that being said, that's, I think, is the best way to get hemp. Some people will respond to CBD. So how do you find out? Well, you take some and see if it helps you. And then others will say, well, what about THC itself? Well, THC works on different receptors than the CBD oil. The CBD oil, they're polyphenol-like substances. They work in a similar way that something like ginger or turmeric would work. But THC activates two different receptors. One's called CB1, which is the euphoria receptor, and then CB2, which is the anti-inflammatory receptor. So the way I look at all this stuff is try it. If you get a benefit, well, then do it. If not, then forget about it.
I Belong in the Kitchen asks, what does the doctor say about gluten cell mimicry?
I don't know what gluten cell mimicry is. If they're talking about if you look at the gluten peptides or gliadin peptides, they can cross-react, and so that you can get similar responses from substances like, say, dairy and other foods. And I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but that may be what they're referring to. And there's a lab out there. This is called Cyrex Labs, Cyrex Labs. They do a big profile that check at all the gliadin peptides, and then cross-reactivity. So some people, yes, other people, no. So how do you find out? You do the test and then you see.
All right, and let's see. There's one here that I wanted to ask you. What is the cause of chronic dis-ease?
Yeah, chronic disease, of course, is like not really a defined thing. So let's just, but the way to look at that would be, it would be low grade. So if you think of what disease is, it would be, I don't feel well. So if I don't feel well, that means that my affect will be dipped. I'm not where my affect should be. I'll be lethargic. I'll be fatigued. I won't have get up and go. I may have aches and pains. And so as the flame goes on, as we age, the flame heightens up, all those symptoms can manifest. So in general, if you just substitute the word chronic malaise for chronic disease, it would be chronic inflammation that causes this. And the biggest drivers, so let's just say that you and I are perfect with our diet, and we stop sleeping and we stress endlessly. Well, that will put us into malaise land, no matter how, even if we're doing IV kale juice, it would make no difference. If we're not, I know, but if we're not sleeping, we're stressing, and we're not exercising, the flame will go on then too. So chronic flame is turned on by a crappy diet, lack of sleep, stressing, and then being sedentary.
Let's see. You know what? And I want to get back into our list here, but somebody asked, or somebody mentioned that they were lactose intolerant or allergic to all things dairy. And from my experience, most people are allergic to pasteurization more than they are to dairy. Do you find that true as well?
I don't know. When you're looking at dairy, you're looking at if you have a lactose issue, it'll be present whether you have non-pasteurized dairy or pasteurized. So lactose intolerance developed before there was pasteurization, because pasteurization is a relatively new thing.
So now if I go out and get the best organic pasteurized milk, when I drink that, my stomach starts gurgling and it just feels awful. And if I buy raw milk, I have no problem with it whatsoever. And it tastes 10 times better anyway.
Yeah, I don't know if that would not be a lactose thing. It's something else, because when you pasteurize something, you do change, and everything is also homogenized too, and the homogenization can change it as well. But I'm not really. I got basically just some grammar for that. I don't have much logic or rhetoric to lay on you there. So that's all I got for you when it comes to dairy.
All right. So what are the omega-6 oils?
So if you want to look at the omega-6 oils where they are, anything that's deep fried, the most common substance that is used in the deep fryer is going to be peanut oil. And so here would be the biggies. It would be peanut oil. And soybean has the least amount of omega-6s, but they've got a 7-to-1 ratio. We want our intake of omega-6 and omega-3 to be less than 4-to-1, hopefully approaching 1-to-1. And so corn oil, safflower, sunflower, cottonseed, peanut, soybean. People think that grape seed oil is great. It is almost pure omega-6. There's no omega-3. So those oils I wouldn't touch on a regular basis. Okay, so let's just say that you're out someplace like I was, I don't know, last month, and someone ordered sweet potato fries. I had some, right? I had a hush puppy, right? Oh my God, it's just terrible. I'm going to die. So
I would, but
yeah. Well, yeah. However you are sensitized, but see, for me, I don't react to those, so I could actually eat them without reaction, which is a real problem. It's actually kind of better if you react, because then you shouldn't do it.
If I know I'm going to the hospital.
There you go. Well, I had a friend who we went out to lunch a few times, and he goes, every time I get these deep fried wings and these French fries, my hands hurt. Like it feels like this. And I said, every time? He goes, yeah, every time. I go, and you're still doing it? I mean, what does it take to get into someone's head that how good the food tastes isn't worth having your hands like an old arthritic guy for the next several hours? It's kind of amazing, actually. So those would be the oils. And so when it comes to I don't really think that we need to do a whole lot of oil with cooking when it comes to say, meat you can grill. I mean, I think that using oil for cooking should be minimized because it's additional calories. The average person doesn't need it. So saute your vegetables or in a little bit of water, add some spices. And if you want to add butter to it afterwards, then mix the butter in afterwards. And that way you have a much better chance of controlling your fat intake because fat calories do build up.
What if you
So,
cook it in the butter and add butter after?
well, it all depends upon what your caloric needs are. And so if you're doing that right now and you look like the same guy, if you take away your beard, you kind of look like, or if you add a beard to your Joe Rogan interview back, however long ago that was, you look like you're the same body weight or pretty close to it, which means that your caloric. So again, it's about keeping below or not exceeding your caloric intake. That keeps the flame away.
Yeah. I'm probably within 5 pounds, but I wanted to gain. See, in 2011, I was still coming out of the whole. See, when I left the hospital in Arequipa, Peru, I was down to 114 or 115.
God, oh man.
So I needed to gain, 50 pounds. So
That's different, though. See, you're, of course, an outlier. An outlier shouldn't be discussed a whole lot because people who are, well, because the outliers are not the norm. You want to talk about, like,
I'm going to drink my butter while you're talking.
There you go. Yeah. Outliers are not the ones who should be the focus of any conversation because then people think that, oh my God, I'm an outlier. This is very common for women who are 40 or older who can't lose weight and they blame their hormones. I've seen this many, many, many times. And then the right approach to diet and movement kicks in for them and they shred 20 or 30 pounds, which means it was all in their head. And so I like to, not describe the outliers too much or get people to think, well, for me, I mean, I just can't lose weight. I just look at food and I gain weight. I'm like, yeah, you probably eat more than just looking at it. That's why you're gaining weight. You can't walk by a donut shop and just pack on fat. You got to go in there and down a few.
Yeah. All right. Let's get into this high carbo promotion that went full scale in 1977 with the McGovern Committee.
Yeah, that was actually an amazing thing. I saw one, and I could not find it again. I saw one YouTube video where they actually captured McGovern essentially scolding the medical doctors who said, we don't have enough research to make this broad, sweeping recommendation of fat limitation and then high starchy carbohydrate intake. And so that kind of like set it pretty strong into writing. It was almost codified at that point. You need 60. So when I started college in 78, I guess. And at that point, and I don't know anything before personal. I don't remember reading about it so much, but it became kind of codified then where a healthy diet is 60 or 65% carbohydrate. And then the rest, a little bit of fat, a little bit of protein. And then they came out with the food pyramid, which is, a perpetuation of that, but it was promoted since 1919. And it just gets, so when you get taught stuff over and over again, and you don't really know what you're learning other than I'm learning what the word carbohydrate means, and I know this, and I know what protein is, and then you take an exam, and then you go, and you got to memorize that, you spit it out, and you go into an exercise physiology book that says the exact same thing. And even though the evidence is kind of weak, but you're not that sophisticated to be able to ask the right questions, next thing you know, 4 or 5 years later, that's what you believe. And it's perpetuated over and over and over again. Why was that done? I don't understand why. I mean, if I was to really like put on my like the reject what the oligarchs put upon us, I mean, yes, because the oligarchs want to keep all the good meat and vegetables for themselves and get the peasants to keep eating the gruel. I mean, think about, right? I mean, think about that. Was it Oliver Twist or?
Well, even Plato talks about that in the Republic to control the peasants, keep them on a vegan diet.
There you go. Oh, I didn't know that, but there you go. So it's hard for me not to think that there's some truth in that because there is even like when I think Banting discovered insulin and they called diabetes back then, like, I don't know, 80 or whatever, 100 years ago, they call it a disease of corpulence. Basically, it's a fatty disease. How do you get fat? Well, you eat a bunch of bread. I mean, how do you fatten up cows? They don't move, and you just pound them with grains.
Yep.
You're not going to get a cow fat.
And people don't see the correlation with that either, and
Yeah,
that's something that I constantly point out to people. It's like, look, they're fattening the cattle for the slaughter with grains, just
right.
hello. So
So
if you look at the population, they're clearly getting the population ready for slaughter. I mean, Loma Linda University Medical Center is not far from here. It's about 25, 30 minutes from here. And it's one of the leading heart hospitals in the world. Well, it's a vegetarian community. How let's do the math on this. How does a vegetarian community that eats, the vegetarian diet is largely a grain and legume diet. So how would a vegetarian community, the Seventh-day Adventist community, have one of the leading heart hospitals in the world? And it's
yeah, it's a problem. So I think that your like broad anti-grain kind of approach is actually very reasonable because of all the whole foods. Whole grains have the weakest. So if you think about, for example, hypertension, it's potassium is like the key mineral for maintaining blood pressure. And if you look at on a calorie to calorie basis of say a couple cups of oatmeal at 300 calories versus 3 or 4 heads of romaine lettuce at 300 calories, you have like 4,000 or more milligrams of potassium in those in the romaine lettuce, and like 300 milligrams of potassium in the oatmeal. So basically, your grains have the lowest nutrition density for the key nutrients, and the greatest chance for overeating them. And that is a good reason why it's smart to do what you're doing. But to be fair and to be accurate scientifically, I didn't say you should never have them in the book. And the reason why is because so you have some brown rice or basmati rice once in a while, or even every day, as long as you're not exceeding your caloric needs, it's not a big deal.
the one exception I'll make is white rice, really, and
Oh yes, terrible.
well, that's the one exception I do eat on
Oh
occasion
okay.
is white rice, basmati rice, But you're saying it's white rice is terrible.
Well, see, these are just terrible in terms of nutrient density. There's not. I don't
Right.
know about. I've never compared basmati to just regular old white rice versus brown rice. But if you're looking at just the worst foods you can possibly get in terms of calorie density, and I mean on a caloric, when you compare calorie to, it's very, very important actually, because what people do, if you look at serving sizes are like a cup or a half a cup. So if you look at a cup of romaine lettuce, it's like, I don't know, 10 calories. If you look at a cup of oatmeal, it's going to be about 150 calories roughly. So you're going to get a whole lot more fiber from a cup of oatmeal than a cup of lettuce. So you have to compare fruits, vegetables, sweet potatoes to grains based on calories. And that's what I do in the grain chapter and other chapters. In the book, I show calorie to calorie and then compare the nutrients. And what you see is that whole grains suck as a calorie, as a nutrient density food from a calorie source.
Now, in my interpretation, somebody just asked another question. I'll get to that in a second. But in my interpretation, the bleached white flour that they added riboflavin and niacin and all of this stuff to is actually better or healthier than the whole grain stuff. But you're saying that's wrong.
I don't really know. It's really because they both suck. I mean, why even do it? Really, in my
Right.
view.
Well, I just don't even touch either.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
now Connor asks, if meat is okay, and of course, we're both going to say yes on that. I got to have my ribeye steaks with all the marbled fat in it, or I just don't feel good. If I don't have at least one steak a week, I don't feel well.
Yeah. So I think it's those who are interested should watch I did this video. It's called Seaman is All Over Jordan Peterson and the Carnivore Diet. And I make fun of Rogan in there too. He brought on one of his PhD buddies, Rhonda Patrick, where they analyzed the carnivore diet. And she misinterpreted it to be an amino acid diet. And the carnivore diet is a high fat diet. It's not a high protein diet.
That's exactly, and so many people don't get that. That's why I
Right.
eat ribeye steaks, because they have all of the fat and everything.
Right. So I would just go. I mean, if you can get nice grass-fed stuff, that's, they're less fatty, but still, that's the way to go. Is because if they're grass fed, then you get the good polyunsaturated fatty acids. But besides that, though, I mean, I've had people who live like literally outside Omaha, where you're going to get corn fed beef, right? So this one guy's like 230, and he's got asthma, postnasal drip, can't sleep, aches everywhere. You go, dude, what do I do? I said, just like eat meat, vegetables, and nuts and sweet potatoes. Or because I don't like sweet potatoes. Well, then eat other. I don't care.
Then eat
just,
yams.
yeah, then do yams or white potatoes. It doesn't make any difference. Just don't eat sugar, flour, refined oils. Avoid all those foods. So I can have steak. Oh yeah. And so he started doing this, and his weight when he was young was like 170, like 6 feet tall. And he goes, well, what should my weight goal be? I said, well, what were you, before you started to gain weight? He goes, I was like 170. I go, well, that's probably, because I can't lose that much weight. Well, then just what do you want your goal to be? Because like, I'll go for 200. So I go, well, then go for 200. So I didn't say you got to go to 170 or 180. Go what works for your brain, because
your body will stabilize at the point you're most healthy at.
Well, here's what happened with this guy. So he loses 30 pounds, starts to exercise and run, and starts to feel great. And then when he hits 200, he's, I can go lower than this. So between 200 and less than that, his postnasal drip went away. His adult onset asthma went away. His aches and pains went away. And he eventually got down to about 168 before he had a little bit of a setback and gained back to about 2 bills or a little bit more. But my point, though, is that I didn't tell him to eat grass-fed stuff and organic, because there was nothing organic in the sort of the outskirts area where he was living. So he just got basically the Omaha ribeyes and chicken and fish and vegetables, and all of those symptoms went away, completely went away. And this guy was 55 then. So my point is that you don't have to have this perfect organic diet to reverse lots and lots of conditions and symptomatology. It's best to do it that way, but if you can't get to it, not a big deal.
So what were we disagreeing on? I think there's like I'm agreeing with just about everything you're saying.
It was the way you presented. It was the way you presented the wheat thing, where
okay,
the wheat causes all these things. Wheat does cause that if you have a celiac disease or a gluten sensitivity or wheat allergy.
What about acne, psoriasis, eczema, schizophrenia, all of that stuff? Arthritis. I mean, these are all things that fall under wheat and low fat, for that matter. And if you start switching those up and going high fat and cutting out the grains, those things clear up.
Well, it's true what you said, that those things can be gliadin induced. But I will say that if you go down to the South Sea Islands, where you can't have a high fat diet, like this, so this group in this island in New Guinea, and it's either the island or it's their tribe.
Hold on a second. Sorry about that. I just accidentally moved a window. Sorry. Go ahead.
So it's your listeners can Google the Catawba study, Kitava, and this population, they get like, I'm going to say 70% of their calories from sweet potatoes, yams, taro, and then fruit, right? And then they get coconut, and then they get your warm water fish, which are not that fatty. So they had a low-fat diet, but they were free. It was free of sugar, flour, refined oils, and it was free of gluten. And so they had a high so-called carb diet, a low-fat diet, moderate protein diet, and they had none of those diseases. And they're barefooted their entire life from birth until they die at like 90 or older. And so the real key is, and listen, I agree with you. I think that I never bring gluten home with me ever. And if I go to a restaurant and they bring out sourdough bread, sourdough has the least amount of gluten in it. And so I'll take a little bit of the crust just because I like the crunchiness, and I'll dip it in olive oil or put some butter on it. But otherwise, I avoid gluten absolutely, because to me, there's no benefit from it. So why waste the calories? So yes, I think that you're right, but you have to just put it in, kind of like the right framework, because the high fat works for you. If you were to move to Catawba, you couldn't really do that unless you just ate coconut all day long, and no one there does that. You find a nice Catawban bride, she's going to feed you. Yeah.
Well, I know one other thing I disagree with you on: microwave ovens.
Okay. I don't disagree with you. I don't think that that's the best way to go. But again, though, out of all the evils, I'll give you an example of what. So there's this. I think she's just a master's degree in nutrition. Her name is Sally Fallon.
Oh yeah,
She
I've interviewed her a couple times.
Yeah. So when Lauren Cordain came out with his paleo book, she just like trashed him. Like, why would you trash eating whole foods? And one of the things that just twisted her up was the fact that he said, if you're going to have soda, just have a diet soda. He didn't say do it. It's not a recommendation. But if you're living in this world right now, and the language that actually scientists use to describe our society, they call it, we live in an obesogenic society. And so living in this obesogenic society, you got to cut back calories. So if you're going to have a soda once in a while, a diet soda once in a while is not going to kill you. That being said, a little microwaving here, it's not going to kill you. I'm not saying that you should do everything, but a little bit, I mean, that's like the worst of the evils. The guy who did some microwaving, who lost all that weight, and how those symptoms go away. So if it was that terrible, and if grain-fed cows were that terrible, and non-organic foods were a problem, then asthma, postnasal drip, aches and pains everywhere, sleeping problems, they wouldn't have gone away.
What
So you
about
have to
aspartame though? I mean, that stuff is bad stuff.
Yeah, I would, if anyone wants to use sweeteners, which I think is dumb anyway, right? I mean, it really doesn't make any sense. But people because they're dietary crackheads, as I call it, they want their fix. They're like jonesing for a fix. The best way to go would be with what are called polyols scientifically, sugar alcohols otherwise.
So
So
xylitol and that stuff.
exactly, erythritol, because what they do is they have a beneficial probiotic effect in the gut flora, and they actually prevent dental caries, and they have no glycemic penalty. So if you want to sweeten something up, go with those and avoid the other ones.
All right, did we cover DASH?
Oh, we did not. But that's just kind of the food pyramid thing. Yeah, DASH stands for dietary approaches to stop hypertension. It doesn't work. And here's how you know: 1 out of 3 adult Americans have hypertension. Now, most of them are not following the DASH diet, but actually, most of them are. Because if you do a 3,000 calorie DASH diet, you're allowed 12 servings of grains, and just 3 need to be whole grains. So basically, the DASH diet is really the dietary approach to promote hypertension, the way the average American interprets it. So yeah, it's a real problem because they endlessly push the whole grains. I couldn't find it recently, but a while back I was looking on, I think it was the American Diabetic Association website. They actually have a food pyramid called the Diabetes Food Pyramid. And they're right. If you follow that program, you're going to have diabetes. You'll get it. Just
All right, and somebody's saying, I feel like I'm in the 80s. It's all about calories. No, we're not saying that I belong in the kitchen. We're just saying, we're still saying, and she's over the last couple of years, she's really turned her health around. She had a lot of problems, and she cut the grains and the wheat and the sugar and everything. Now she's probably the only thing left she may still need to cut is vegetable oils, which I don't think she even has to cut that anymore. But she's really turned her health around. So all he's saying is just find your caloric level. To me, and you and I kind of talked about this before, it's, I don't even know that if it's so much calories that count because our bodies absorb nutrients. We don't really burn them per se, so is it really based on thermodynamics?
Well, I would say this: anyone who loses weight is because they eat less calories. And the second anyone does a diet modification for themselves, they're like so I'm putting my hand over the right side of my frontal bone, and underneath that area is what's called the prefrontal cortex. Further back is where movement occurs, but up front here is where is where humans elaborate thoughts. We inhibit impulses, and so when it comes to I forget the reason why I was going there. I'll just do the calorie thing. So okay, so the second that I decide to I'm going to change my diet around, I automatically my brain kicks in and starts to reduce calorie intake automatically. Anyone who wants to lose weight can lose weight on any calories. You can lose weight if you're enormous, you can lose weight on donuts. I'm not saying you should. Okay, I'm not saying that you should do that. It's the dumbest idea ever because you want to decondition yourself from those foods, but calories absolutely matter. Now, I'm talking about the threshold. If you are at this, if you need 2,000 calories per day and you eat 2,500 calories per day, you will gain weight. It is unavoidable. So if you want to maintain your body weight, well, then you got to be at your caloric need or less if you want to lose weight. And so it's not like a throwback to the 80s. It's just basic. I mean, it's just basic physiology that the scientists have made a bit of a mess of it because they say, well, fat is used differently. This is the way the ketogenic diet, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, if you eat 5,000 calories per day of butter and ribeyes, you're going to be one big fat man in 6 months. I'll tell you that much. You will not be able to burn off the extra 2,500 calories while you're sleeping and stay the same weight that you are right now. So you will be in ketosis, but you'll also develop diabetes and heart disease and perhaps cancer over time if you eat 5,000 calories per day of fat. And that just needs to get into people's heads. I don't understand why it's so sort of complicated.
All right, let's see here. Radical veganism.
Yeah, that's a problem. So they changed their name around. It's kind of like how the communist socialists change their names around. They come out with new words, right? The neo this, the this or the that. Well, vegan. When I was growing up, when I first learned about what vegetarian meant that you never ate anything animal. And then they came up with the word lacto-ovo vegetarian to basically mean a modified vegetarian diet. And then they used the word vegan to mean what it used to mean in terms of vegetarian. So vegan now means nothing animal of any kind at all. So as opposed to just saying that, like that documentary called What the Health?
Yeah.
What a dumb movie. I mean, just the dumbest. They basically call it a plant-based diet, but a plant-based diet is, in their, the way they do it, is pure veganism. Now, if you look at, say, my diet will be plant-based. So I'll have a bowl of vegetation, and on top of it, I'm going to throw animal products. So that would be, the base is vegetables. I mean, that's what that word means, right? If you like, what's your house built on? Well, it has a slab, so it's concrete based. Right?
Yeah, great point.
But that is what that word means. So plant-based diet is really, I think, subversive. And
well,
so,
of course. And well, and here's the thing is, one thing that I don't remember who it was with. It could have been with Dr. Davis years ago, but the vegans, the tractors and whatnot going through the fields kill so much of the wildlife, and then they, it's basically the religion is, or the religion. I just kind of let the cat out of the bag. The whole thing is it's virtue signaling, and it's a moral superiority complex. And, my having been a vegan for a while, all it did was land me in the hospital, because what you end up with eating is a lot of processed foods, a lot of grains, and a lot of legumes. And so, that's not stuff that you can sustain. And then your fats, okay, so what are you going to eat for fats? Let's say coconut oil. Okay, so you're going to import that from the other side of the world. Is that sustainable? Should we be buying, or partaking in a diet where half of your diet comes from the other side of the planet versus what you can attain locally? So all of that is a problem. But then, it's not really a vegan diet because what's probably sustaining them is all of the bugs and insects and all of that, everything that's the dead animals that are in their stuff. The mice, the foxes, the snakes, the birds, the all of the small animals that live in all of the fields that these tractors run over, that they think they're so morally superior for only eating that particular way.
Well, I would say that that's a bit of an outlier statement. Here's why. It's because I know lots of vegans.
Yeah, somebody said bug lives matter.
Yeah, but I would say that is, for some people, it absolutely is. It is a religion. It's virtue signaling. It's moral superiority. But for other people, like if you're a Seventh-day Adventist, they don't run around with their shoulders out, behaving all morally superior. I mean, some do, because those kind of people are everywhere.
Hey, I went to a Seventh-day Adventist school as a kid, so
yeah. So I know a lot of Seventh-day Adventists, or I did, and they were not that outlier population. Some people are just vegan for whatever reason. It works better for them. They believe it. So if you want to be a vegan, you still need to get fats in your diet. And so if I was to go vegan, I would whole hemp seeds would be a huge part of my diet. Macadamia nuts would be pretty much the only nut I would try to eat. I like other nuts, but macadamia nuts have the absolute best fatty acid profile of any nut there is.
So what if you couldn't import macadamia nuts from Hawaii or from Asia and all of this stuff? What if everybody had to go back to eating locally? How long would they survive on a vegan diet? Maybe
it would be very difficult.
A few days or a week. In my opinion, it's the vegan diet's more of an urban religion.
Yeah. Well, if you look at any culture, well, and really, I think a good example of this is you take. Remember that guy Andrew Zimmern, Weird Foods or whatever he was. He was on one of the cable channels where he would travel around the world and visiting different cultures and see what they ate. And they ate the weirdest like animal creatures you could possibly imagine. So animals I didn't even know existed, and then vegetation I didn't know existed, but I never saw in any of those shows. And of course, bugs.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Well, I've interviewed what's her name, Daniela Martin on entomophagy, and I've had waxworm tacos and stuff like that. My son had to get the scorpion lollipop, obviously sugar in it, but he ate the whole thing.
Yeah. So when you look at these cultures, none of them are vegan, or let's just say it's the rare outlier, and I can't even name one that is vegan. And so if you look at culturally around the world, going from the North Pole and then right down into southern Africa and Australia and then South America, you don't see people who are avoiding animal products. So I think it's a real problem. So for me, I would, if I had to live off the land, well, for me, since I'm near the ocean, I'd be fishing and then growing. I think that the best way, if you really want to get the best amount of calories you possibly can, is to grow sweet potatoes or white potatoes. And I say white potatoes because people get afraid of that one just because, oh my God, white potatoes, carbohydrate, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you look at the peasant populations in Europe in the 1700s to 1800s, the most healthy ones were the Irish. I mean, they were all beat up, but the Irish ate potatoes. They'll get some fish, some cabbage, and what were the Brits and the French eating? It's not a correct quote, but Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake, right? So just flour. So they were getting bread, and other stuff was rotting. So they lived on, the British peasants and the French peasants were basically flour-based. The Irish, potato. So the best way, and you can grow so much more potatoes in a piece of land than otherwise. That's one way to really like beef up your calories. And sweet potatoes in particular have a very, very minimal glycemic penalty. They got a decent amount of fiber. They get all the phytonutrients. So that's a good way to go. But yes, it'd be very difficult. So for me down here in Florida, it would be, what's interesting? I didn't know this until recently, is that papayas in Central Florida and North Florida, if you get a freeze, they get hammered pretty bad. But you can grow them even into North Florida. You take off the green ones and you peel it off like you would peel off the skin of anything, and you can put it right through a spiralizer and get papaya linguine, which is highly anti-inflammatory. So if I was to just live off my property, I've got 50 food trees on my property. It's a small 1/6 of an acre growing area. I've got about 50 food trees, 7 papayas. They're ripening like crazy. But I would live on avocados, sweet potatoes, moringa, and the papaya linguine, and then fish.
Well, and you got a couple of people in the chat saying, and you're leaving out gators.
Gators, yeah, that's true. But but then I have to watch that crazy gator show more and read the subtitles to know what the hell they're saying, to know how to hunt for them. Although I will tell you, the first time I ever came to Florida was when I was 17, turning 18. A buddy and I we got on our 12 speeds in New Jersey and pedaled down to Florida, and we visited his family in Central Florida, his distant relatives, and one of their buddies, they were gator hunters. So we went out like basically 9 o'clock at night, pitch black, on this maybe 12-foot wooden boat with a quiet motor. And they would shine the light across the lake, and the alligators' eyes would be like this. They would be mesmerized by the light, and then they drive up on, they blast it with like a, like a harpoony thing, and the gators go flying all over the place. They get tired and they whack them between the cranial bones. And we pulled in like a 10-footer into this 12-foot boat. So it's possible, but you need experience. So if that guy has that experience, well, then good for him.
Seems like a dangerous.
Dangerous. I'd rather just take a fishing pole and go out to the jetty and do it that way.
Somebody asked, "Are you bragging, doctor, about your fruit trees?"
Oh, well, but see, but it's a good point though. Sustainability is really important. And so to me, like, why have grass when you can have food growing?
So did we cover Rogan's buddies?
No, we didn't. I mean, do you want to do that, or do you want to do this maybe some other time? We're pushing like an hour and a half. I don't know how long you typically do these things.
Usually an hour and a half. We can wrap it up here. We can, a lot of times people just go like 10, 15 minutes over if you want. It does, it's not a very set schedule there.
Well, I would say this about Rogan. Like the way he his is kind of interesting. He has 3 or so people who were on his show several times. They present themselves as paleoscientists. And technically be a scientist, you should put your name, you should be able to put the author's name into PubMed and find papers where they've written on those topics. And so Rogan's paleoscientists, and we'll leave them nameless because people can figure out who they are. None of these guys have any scientific background at all, and they actually frame the paleo diet as a low-carb, high-protein diet. And that's not what it is. The paleo diet is purely a geographic diet based upon what you can eat. So you're in what, Northern California? Southern California. Okay. So if you go up to Northern California, well, the food would be different up there, what could grow, than Southern California. You go further up into northern part of Seattle or northern part of Washington and Victoria up out in the British Columbia area. Well, then you're going to have different foods that can be grown there and different animals that will be there. And so food is based, the paleo diet is based upon what people consume locally. So these fake paleo, I call them faux or fake paleo or paleo posers. Well, that's what they are. They make it sound like, well, salt's okay. Well, salt it was not a staple really anywhere. I mean, a staple condiment anywhere. And I'm not saying that you can't use salt, but from a pure paleo way, it's basically identifying what people ate depending upon where they lived. And I can tell you, there wasn't much salt unless they extracted some salt from the ocean down in the South Pacific. I'm not saying that they did or they didn't, but where would you get your salt if you're living in Wyoming? I mean, I don't know if you can actually get that. So to say it's a salt diet, or if this small little outlier population ate some grains, well, that doesn't mean it's paleo. If you go from the Arctic Circle down to what's this? Is Argentina? That's the southernmost country in South America. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a different diet completely. And so then Rogan has on another guy who's a keto guy, and the thing about this whole keto craze is it's kind of disingenuous in many ways because when the keto diet was called the Atkins diet, nobody wanted to do it, and the Atkins diet was
Atkins slipped and hit his head on the concrete and died from it. And so therefore it was a bad diet, Right.
Yeah. I mean, that just shows that people are stuck in grammar and they don't have any logic, right? They have no logic at all, much less any
never mind, it was a snowstorm. He slipped on the ice, hit his head on the concrete and died a few days later,
Plus the guy was overweight for sure. So you can become obese on a ketogenic diet if you eat too much calories. It's that simple. So before it was keto, it was Atkins, and nobody was out there saying Atkins is great, just do the high fat thing. And in fact, Atkins, when his book first came out, at least when I first read it, you go to the pharmacy, get your keto strips, and you pee on them until your keto sticks turn purple. Now you're in ketosis. So why is it only popular now versus back then? It's because people don't think for themselves. So Rogan has on this keto guy who's in a lot of papers, but he was not a keto researcher from the start. He kind of fell into it because the movement was already going on. I'll leave his name unmentioned as well. So if any of your listeners want to read read and listen to the proper keto people to listen to, the best guy to start with, his name is Stephen with the P-H-E-N, Stephen or Stefan. It's not Stefan, it's with P-H-E-N, Stephen. Phinney, Phinney. So he got his MD PhD back in the late 70s, and he fell into doing, for whatever reason, ketogenic diet research. So I think his first paper was published in 1980, and virtually nobody knows who Stephen Phinney is out there in keto land when they're busy bragging about them being the keto masters. Very few people know who Lauren Cordain is when they say, well, I'm a paleo person. A lot of these stupid paleo recipes, they're so high in calories, you become obese on these particularly these paleo desserts. Give me a break. If you want to have, right, coconut flour, kind of paleo-y, I suppose. Coconut flour can make you fat as a house in no time because the caloric density is profound in coconut flour. So you can be just this obese person in paleo land. So you want to learn about paleo, Lauren Cordain and his people. You want to learn about keto, Stephen Phinney. So after Rogan has this guy on, a couple of days later, he has on another guy. And he was saying, well, I don't do everything for keto. It's not best for everybody else. So Rogan goes, well, this is going to confuse some of my listeners because of the other guy who he had on, demonstrating again the fact that there's no logic or rhetoric in Rogan's nutritional world for himself. Because if you go from the Arctic Circle, where everybody is in keto for like 8 months out of the year, because that's all you can eat is fat and it's a little bit of protein. You go down to New Guinea, where they're living, you avoid the cannibal island, of course. You go to the Catawba area, and they're living on basically potatoes and fruit. And they don't have any of the cardiovascular disease, the digestive problems, or anything at all. And all of that stuff is missed if you don't sort of have the orientation from the original primary author type people. For paleo, it would be Cordain. And for keto, it would be Phinney, Phinney.
What do you think of Dr. Kate Ram-Blue's research?
I don't know who that is.
She's done the research on vitamin K2 and regulating calcium in the body and all that. I've had her on the show twice, but she talks about how essentially, if I'm recalling correctly, to summarize, would be that heart disease and whatnot came about with the creation of vegetable oils and the amalgamation of grains, gluten, etc., and the misregulation of calcium in the body.
So the challenge I have with that is, and she's probably more detailed than that, obviously, but so obviously, you have two types. Yeah. So you have two types of K. You've got what's called phyloquinone.
And she's talking about specific, exactly. Yeah.
So you have, it's called vitamin K1, phyloquinone.
Which is about clotting and not calcium regulation.
Actually, it kind of works. I can't say for sure if that's it completely because I'll explain why. So if you look at K2, well, first of all, let's do phyloquinone. So you eat a bunch of green vegetables, and the Catawbans, who don't really eat a lot of your natural K2 food. So you'll find K2 in like eggs, cheese, and this really stinky ass stuff called natto, which is this fermented soybean, which virtually you would only eat in certain parts of Asia. So if you go back to the Catawbans, where they get most of their calories from, the potatoes, sweet yams, and then taro, and then fruit, and then greens, because they got a lot of greens also. So they get their K1 there. They don't get any K2 in their diet. So the way this works is that if you have a healthy gut flora, the healthy gut flora converts K1 into K2. So if you avoid eating green vegetables and you disrupt your gut flora by living on sugar, flour, and refined oils, you now have lost the mechanism. First of all, you lose the mechanism because of the gut flora change, and you lose the K1 delivery. So by default, you'll become deficient in K2. And so K2 in the body, it participates in clotting to some degree, but what it does, it does kind of control calcium homeostasis. So if you don't have enough K2 in the body, you'll tend to calcify your blood vessel walls. There's a specific protein that K2, it's called matrix GLA protein. It keeps calcium out of vessel walls. And then you have a K2 protein called osteocalcin in bone that keeps calcium in bone. So that's what she's talking about there. But the reason why you've got a K2 deficiency is because no green vegetables and the gut flora change. And therefore, people need to take K2 supplements.
And she's talking about getting it from cheese,
Right.
eggs,
Cheese,
natto,
eggs. Yeah.
etc.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would recommend checking out her book. In fact, I think she wrote actually the first book on it.
Yeah,
But
I have a bunch of the primary research from the European guys who've been looking at K2. Yeah, two different types of K2. If you go look for a supplement, you got what's called MK4,
right,
and then you have smaller ones called MK7, 8, and 9.
right.
And it appears that the MK7, 8, or 9, if you're going to do a supplement, has a more beneficial effect on the blood vessels and for bone.
All right, and then let's see, and I want to get into the high fat air quotes term here in a second, but strokes, are those the same root cause as heart attacks, heart disease?
Yeah, yeah. It's all about uh, and here's the thing about the way the flame works. Like if my well, we'll have to use my hand. If the flame goes on, it can manifest many different ways. You just don't know, and that's where your genetic susceptibility kind of kicks in. So if you're susceptible to, or if you have, and really where the worst buildup of atherosclerosis occurs is where you have high turbulence in your arteries. Now, this is something very, very interesting. So if you think about a blood test, you draw blood from your veins, clearly not your arteries, right? If you draw blood from your arteries, you're gonna have a spurting event taking place, which is why you got to draw from veins. So you draw your blood from your veins, and that tells you the amount of your cholesterol level and everything else in your veins, but it's mirrored in your artery system. So why would it be that atherosclerosis never builds up in veins, only in arteries, even though you have the exact same glucose, fat, cholesterol issues in both veins and arteries? And the reason why is because of turbulence. If you take a piece of vein and you put it into, say, replace a coronary artery, well, that vein will then develop atherosclerosis as well, because now the vein is subjected to turbulence. So no matter where you go, like if you go out to they're called the Maasai warriors. They're like the 6 foot thin black dudes in Africa, where they're called pastoralists. They basically graze their cattle across the plains, and their diet for like historically was basically meat, milk, and blood. That's what they ate. And so when a researcher went down there and went over there and looked at them, he found that there was atherosclerosis, but they had big, wide open arteries. And so why would they not develop atherosclerosis? Or well, they had the turbulence, but they didn't have the pro-inflammatory factors that we have otherwise. So the best way to look at this would be, have you heard the term tendinopathy before? Well, certainly osteoarthritis. So if you look at osteoarthritis in terms of its chemistry, and you compare its chemistry, you take it as chemistry and you say, well, what is this disease? It mirrors atherosclerosis. And so what happens is that joints go through their osteoarthritic process through the same lipid deposition process that blood vessels go through or tendons go through. So if I'm 250 and I decide I'm going to go run and I have a heart attack, you say, well, you had heart disease, and that's the reason why you ran. You just overburdened this heart that couldn't handle the flow, and you had a heart attack. But if I develop joint pain or tendon pain, you say, well, it's because you strained those tissues. But in fact, what happens is that the same pro-inflammatory degenerative changes take place in joints and tendons, such that normal loading and normal turbulence becomes pro-inflammatory if you live in a pro-inflammatory state. And that is the cause of atherosclerosis. It has nothing to do with just your LDL level. Speaking of LDL, which is the thing that everyone's afraid of, the bad cholesterol, right, versus the good HDL. I mean, when you know the trivium of it, it's like so moronic, it's shocking.
Really?
So, it's just brutal. Yeah. So you take LDL cholesterol, low density lipoprotein cholesterol versus high density lipoprotein cholesterol. And so think about this. The average person, they've got twice or 3 times as much LDL. Really should be about twice as much, and sometimes it's less, but more LDL in circulation than HDL. If LDL was so bad, why would we have not biologically altered the production of LDL so that we stop killing ourselves? If LDL was so bad, why would we always make more L than H? Right there, it's a suspicious thing. And so then when you look at LDL cholesterol, for it to be atherogenic, it has to go through an oxidation process. So now imagine you had a big old softball, and it's called a big, soft, buoyant LDL particle. Once you go pro-inflammatory and become hyperglycemic, metabolic syndrome, obese, what happens is the LDL particle becomes small and dense. So would you like to get hit with a softball or a hard ball? We all know the answer is softball, right? The speed is just bigger, dispersion will hurt less. Well, would you like to be hit with a waterlogged, fungus-ridden hardball that weighs 5 times more than a regular hardball, or a regular hardball? And the answer is, of course, the regular hardball. So this is what happens. You got this buoyant LDL particle. It becomes small and dense, and then it becomes oxidized. And this oxidized LDL functions as an autoantigen such that you have an immune reaction that's no different than autoimmune disease. And think about this. No one listening here, or let's just say 10,000 or a million listeners at some point with this, virtually none of them would know that your LDL particle is anti-inflammatory when it's soft and buoyant, pro-inflammatory when it's small and dense and oxidized. And the driver of excess LDL and reduced HDL is insulin. And no one taking a statin drug is saying, hey, listen, this statin drug is blocking the enzyme in the cholesterol pathway that insulin stimulates. So stop eating sugar, flour, refined oils, move your ass, get your weight back to where you were when you were younger than 25 years of age, assuming that was when you had a proper body weight. That was a mouthful.
Now, all of this stuff, now when were vegetable oils introduced? What, about 1910, 1915, 1920?
I think the first one out was a Lardy Crisco-y oil thing. It was a vegetable base. I think it was some type of
trans fatty, nasty.
I forget what year it was.
Coagulated nastiness.
I remember this.
But it seems that you mentioned her earlier from Weston A. Price Foundation. Sally Fallon. She had studied. The first heart attacks began immediately after vegetable oils were released onto the market.
I have a hard time believing that that's the case, and the reason why is because if you fatten yourself up and don't move, you can have a heart attack on butter and broccoli. So I would say this though: if you look at your trans fats and her so Sally Fallon is not a typical scientist, but she did some work with a woman named Mary Enig.
Yeah, correct.
And Mary Enig is a lipid chemist.
Right.
Right. She is really good. She passed away recently, maybe within the last 5 years. And she wrote I can't remember the name of her book, but it's an excellent book on fats. So I would recommend Mary Enig's book on fats. That's a fantastic book. So Mary Enig was one of the first who, along with other researchers back in the early 70s, identified the pro-inflammatory reactions that occur with your trans fatty acids that are made from the partial hydrogenation process. And so that certainly accelerates. And what they found is the people who already have like this is not an Enig or a Fallon deal, but this is the standard literature. When the researchers gave trans fats to healthy weight, normal active people without any signs of heart disease versus the same age people with heart disease, there was a much more robust inflammatory reaction to the trans fats, even though they both took the same trans fats in. So when you're lean and healthy and deflamed, as I call it, you're much more resilient to all types of pro-inflammatory insults.
What about going off? It's just following on the same lines. What about Dr. Udo Erasmus's book, Fats That Heal, Fats That Kill? What do you think of his research?
I think that his book is good. I'm not crazy about his oils, where his oil concoction, to me, contains too much omega-6s. If you're going to take any oil supplement at all, it should be just a little bit of a EPA DHA and avoid the rest of it. And then get your other fatty acids from like olive oil and butter. So I don't like that part.
You're not against olive oil as long as you don't cook with it.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that cooking with oil at low temperature is the best way to go. I mean, if you think about the Italians and the Greeks forever and ever and ever, I mean, if you look at a traditional Italian kitchen and the way they cook, they're not burning the crap out of their olive oil. I mean, it's not like a heavy burning, smoking thing.
Right.
So no, I'm not opposed to that. I just think that we need to temper our caloric intake because pretty much everybody is overweight. And so olive oil is good. Not if you have 300 calories per day of it on top of a high calorie diet already without getting rid of other calories. So it all depends upon the caloric intake. And the best way to do this in terms of markers, if you get a tape measure and do waist hip ratio, so you get like around your belly button, it or a little bit above or a little bit below where it's the fattest, and then right around your hips where your hip bones stick out, where you pick up most of the glute mass. You do your waist, you divide it by your hips. And for women, it should be below 0.8, and for men, it should be below 0.95. Anybody who's above that, unless they're an outlier, we're going to forget about those guys. Anyone who is, for the average person, which is the vast majority, that is the perfect way to identify your inflammatory state. It turns out that when your waist-hip ratio starts to soar, blood sugar correlates with it, hemoglobin A1C correlates, C-reactive protein correlates with it, circulating endotoxin from the gut correlates with it. So that is the greatest simple way to identify if you're a flamer or not. And then you want to get, if you want to get below 0.8 and you want to be below 0.95 if you're a guy. Yeah. A little nutrition humor is always fun, you know?
All right. Yeah. And then the high fat term still scares people for no reason, you know, and when I started going high fat, this was what, 2011, 2012. You know, it took me a little while to edge into it and, you know, okay, well, I'm going to eat extra butter and eggs today. And wait, well, I didn't have a heart attack. And then after a while, it's like, wait a second, I'm starting to feel a whole lot better, you know, and the more fat I ate, the better I felt. And still for the last, probably 7 years now, I try to keep my dietary intake at least probably 50% or more fat per day.
Very smart move. Yeah. And it's interesting. So you're a smart cerebral guy who thinks about stuff and you trivium and quadrivium yourself, right? And and look at the power of your amygdala kicking in the fat fear. It's absolutely it is brutal propaganda and conditioning. It's just
for 85 years of the nonsense, you know.
Absolutely unbelievable.
Grains good, fat bad. Eat your wheat, and you know they did plant all those 20 gazillion hectares or acres or whatever of wheat back in the 20s and 30s, and they needed to sell all of that stuff. So, you know, they wiped out the Great Plains, created the Dust Bowl, and had to sell all of the wheat from the aftermath of it, right?
It's really a problem. I'm telling you, people should just grow sweet potatoes and whatever food they can grow in their yard. That's what they should do.
Well, but then they wouldn't be getting coconut oil from the other side of the planet and killing orangutans.
But there are options, though. It is interesting. There is definitely some exploitation of the coconut oil producing countries, for sure.
All right, and we got two more here. You want to cover those limbic fears? Somebody like me, should I just forever and ever more avoid a birthday cake?
Well, you know, it all depends. You see, if that birthday cake trips you back into being a dietary crackhead, and you know that that's like an enemy of you, then you should not.
Well, I wouldn't fall back into a dietary crackhead. That would be dumb. But you know,
right.
I mean, you know.
But for some people, though, they just simply have not worked their prefrontal cortex enough to effectively resist those calories once they get a taste.
Usually, though, I just, you know, anything wheat, my body now just automatically rejects it. You know, if it's like a gluten-free cake or something, I'll have it, but which is, you know, like Dr. Davis said, less bad is not good, you know.
Right. Right. He's absolutely correct. Yeah, and I like his book a lot, actually. And he complimented that high fat diet book that was Nina Teal, something like that, came in like 2012, did a decent book on fats. No, I would say that the only reason, if I go to a birthday party, which I really tend not to do because I'm kind of a loner, but if I did, I would have a little piece of it. You know, why insult the kid or whoever it is? And, you know, I have a little piece, right? But I don't like doing it because the thing is, I like the taste. And I do not see any point in activating that part of my brain. I don't want to, it's called the reward path. It's called the mesolimbic reward pathway.
And you start, you know, acting like a rat hitting the lever over and over. Is that?
That's right. Yeah. You know about the rat study? They just forego, Yeah, they didn't eat. They just sat there hitting that rat buzzer, and they just sat there. They avoided sex. So rats are very social. They just sat there blasting that buzzer. Yeah, they forgo everything. So I don't see the point in turning on that part of the brain at all. And so it's dietary propaganda essentially that your brain is being captured by. So avoiding it's a good idea until you can absolutely control yourself.
All right. Steven says, eat to live, don't live to eat. That's very
There you
well
go.
said.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely. Yeah. But this whole idea of flame, though, the flame idea is, the question should be is, will this flame me or will it not flame me? So will it inflame me or will it deflame me?
Don't be a dietary flamer.
Right. There you go. There you go.
All right. So, yeah, just get that into your head. I don't want to be a dietary flamer, and that should
That's
cure all
right.
your dietary problems right there.
Yeah.
And with all the dietary research that we know, Americans are fatter than ever.
Correct.
And they want to put 9-year-olds now on statin drugs, and that's not going to solve anything. That's, and we need the fats. And so then that causes, your brain is made up of cholesterol and fat. So then, and your reproductive system. And so then they're causing, a landslide of future health problems. Thank you, Stephen. A landslide of future health problems by putting kids on statin drugs when all they have to do is get them off the soda pop, stop feeding them pretzels and cake and Kool-Aid and, I don't know, do kids eat Kool-Aid anymore, drink it? And all of these things, stop with the vegetable oils, and then the inflammation will stop and they'll go back to normal.
That's exactly right. But that hurts the big oligarchy industrial complex for drugs, because if to keep the economy going, right? Think about our economy runs on sugar, flour, refined oils, the drugs to treat those conditions. It numbs our brain, and then we just bomb everybody around the world with all of our other powders, right? So that drives our economy. If you had a healthy population,
that's another conversation we'll have to get into later. But
yeah. But I mean, think about it though. How and once your brain is numbed and inflamed, it's difficult to focus, and then it's difficult to focus on your life. Much less take your head up and look around what's taking place in the world, so that one is not then brainwashed by propaganda, depending upon the fake left or right wing that people tend to be brainwashed by.
Dr. Seaman, great show tonight. I think we've pretty much got through everything that both you and I had laid down for tonight. We'll have to get you back on again soon. We've got more research and topics to cover. You and I had a really deep couple-hour conversation a few weeks ago, and got some interesting material yet to go. And so I really appreciate your time coming on tonight. If anybody wants to post up any super chats, do you want to cover any questions from the audience?
Absolutely, whatever you want.
If anybody's out there, otherwise we're probably going to wrap it up here. And thanks for all of the comments and great participation tonight. And Brian says, Brian, you don't need to say that. He says, Seaman.
Here's the thing, though. If you want to do a Seaman joke, I'll give you that criteria, right? So you see, since your last name is Irvin, it could be Jones is up, Smith is on deck, and Irvin is in the hole, right? So to do an effective Seaman joke, you have to be able to substitute somebody else's name in there for it to work properly, right? So if you're a great defender, you say Irvin is all over the field, right? So that's the only way to enter the Seaman joke world, which is fine by me.
And to make it really work, you have to be self-deprecating as well. So
you have to be, yeah. That took a long time to deal with that one, because oh my God, this is a terrible thing. Now I love it though. And actually, I'll give you one more joke.
All right.
My cousin with the same last name, he's a pilot. And he changed his last name to his mother's maiden name because he couldn't handle being Captain Seaman in the cockpit. Who wouldn't want to be that guy? This is Captain Seaman. Welcome.
And that's a true story.
True story.
Wow, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
Captain Seaman in the cockpit. Oh, wow. All right. Well, that's hilarious. So I guess that's a wrap for the night. I don't see any super chats coming up. And someone said I lost 30 pounds last year, kept it off, though a bit challenging. Weigh what I weighed in 1980. Feel amazing. Think clearly. No BS. Deeply spiritual process. Transformative. And I know that's the case for a lot of people in the audience. And there's a lot of people in the audience that have followed me from the beginning when I was doing shows from the hospital in Peru.
Oh, wow.
I actually did a show from the hospital, from the ICU in Peru. And, it's like, and the doctor came in and said, well, I have good news and bad news. What do you want first? Well, the good news is, I can cure you. And in Peru, they're allowed to use that word. But the bad news is, I don't think you'll live through the night.
Jeez.
So, actually, and they were expecting me to die on my son's birthday. So that was tough.
Yeah.
So happy third birthday, son, But anyway, thanks everyone and good night. And thanks for all your support. Go to logosmedia.com to support the show. David, what is your website?
DeFlame.com.
DeFlame.com. So don't be a flamer. Get deflamed at DeFlame.com.
There you go.
And there's all sorts of jokes of seaman in the cockpit and everything else that can go along with that.
Awesome.
All right, everyone, everybody, good night, and see you next week.